Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having an amazing day and thanks so much for joining me for another art video. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be taking you through my full process for a pen and ink city scene sketch. I'm sharing everything from how I take a reference photo and create a preliminary pencil sketch freehand based loosely on that photo, making any changes that I feel I need to make, simplifying the scene, and then I'll be moving on to sharing the pen and ink techniques that I like using in order to define edges, create contrast, and bring in interesting mark making and alternative shading techniques into my sketch. Now, if you're interested in developing your skills with this kind of scenery sketch or urban sketching, that kind of thing, I would highly recommend checking out a video that I shared a few weeks ago in which I share my main tips to simplify complex scenes. I'm going to be expanding on many of the things that I shared in that video and also adding to that. I'll make sure to leave a link to that video as well as other videos that I refer to in today's tutorial down below in the description box for you in case you'd like to go and check them out. All right, so without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight in. So these are the supplies that you're going to be seeing me use today. I'm going to be working in my sketchbook from Strathmore. This is a regular drawing sketchbook. The surface of the paper is quite smooth and the thickness of the paper is 60 pounds or 89 GSM. I'm going to be using an HB drawing pencil from Faber-Castell's 9000 series. And when I get to the pen and ink process, I'm going to be using a pigment liner from Staedtler in 0.3 tip size. I have a ruler on hand as well, but this is just so that I can create my drawing space, my area that I'm going to be working in the very beginning of this process. And then I just set it aside because I want to practice my freehand sketching. All right, this is the reference photo that I'm going to be working with. I found it via unsplash.com and it was taken by photographer Camille Brodard. I'll be leaving a link to this reference photo down below in the text section of this post in case you'd like to download it yourself and practice with it. All right, so with all that out of the way, the very first thing that I do before even putting pencil or pen to paper is I take a moment to observe the reference photo, or if I'm actually sketching something that I have in front of me in real life, I take a moment to observe what's in front of me. I ask myself, what are the challenges present in this scene? Every single scene that you might decide to draw or paint brings its own combination of challenges. And by challenges, I mean, what important things are being covered up that might confuse me when I am drawing those 3D structures in that perspective? Is there any type of specific perspective present in the scene, linear perspective, like 1 or 2 point perspective, 3 point perspective, etc.? Are there difficult compound structures present in the photo that might be worth practicing separately? Compound structures, by the way, are structures that are made up of 2 or more simple 3D forms. A lot of the times when we're drawing scenes, many of those buildings, houses, whatever it is, are going to be compound structures. And this is why it's so important that we get great at drawing simple 3D forms like rectangular prisms, triangular prisms, cylinders, etc. And that we train ourselves to be able to acknowledge what we have around us as being one or a combination of 2 or more simple 3D forms. Because if we don't get good at this, then it's going to be very difficult for us to transmit that depth, that perspective present in the scene. In this one, there is 1 point perspective happening on the right side. If you were to draw straight lines going down those slanted or diagonal lines present in the right side of the photo, those lines would eventually converge at a vanishing point that would be way off to the side, off the picture towards the right. Aside from those converging lines on the right side of the image here, I can also see that this is 1 point perspective because this plane or side of the building closest to us is almost flat facing forwards in front of us. So we also have these nearly perfect horizontal lines all throughout this front face of the building that is closest to us. So if we take our vantage point into account, This closest side of the building to us, this closer plane of the building, is flat, and we can draw many of these elements as simple rectangles. But when it comes to its right plane, or the plane that is receding away from us into the distance, that right plane has a lot of slanted lines and diagonals that we have to make happen in our drawing if we want this to look believable. And many of those slanted lines or diagonals that you're going to be drawing have to look like they would be converging at a vanishing point that is off your drawing space to the right. However, don't get confused, because there are many structures that have slants in their design. And those are not lines that have to converge at the vanishing point. What do I mean by this? There is the top slanted edge of that little dividing wall that is protecting some of the tables, the one that has all these cool letters in it. That little wall has a diagonal or a slanted top edge. That diagonal wouldn't go to the vanishing point because it's just that the structure has a slanted edge at the top. That's its design. It's the way that it is. Another couple of things that have slants in this image that don't necessarily converge at the vanishing point, because this is part of their structure, part of their design, are the awnings. So the slants or diagonals that we perceive as the sides of the awning, those don't go to the vanishing point. However, the two lines created by the front flap of the awning that is hanging down, those would converge at the vanishing point. So essentially, every line that you would see as being completely horizontal and straight, if you were standing in front of that structure, those are the lines that are going to converge at the vanishing point. The lines that converge at the vanishing point are the straight lines that you would see as being completely straight and horizontal if you were standing in front of them, not the others. If you were standing in front of the right plane of this building, completely flat facing towards it, all of the lines that you would perceive as being straight horizontal lines, those are the lines that get distorted when you see that plane at a different perspective, from a different vantage point. Now, how do I know all this and how I'm able to draw this in a believable way, especially freehand, is because I took time to learn about perspective and 3D form, and I took time to practice drawing simple 3D forms in a 1 and the 2 and the 3-point perspective grids. And this enables me to better understand what I am seeing, to be able to simplify what I am seeing so that I'm able to build it up from scratch, and also to be able to make up for the information that I'm visually lacking. In this photo, we're not able to see the bottom edge of the right plane of the building because there are a bunch of chairs and people and that little dividing wall covering that up. And this is going to happen in virtually any scene or even any still life that you're trying to draw or paint. And this is why it's so important to get that practice in. All right, so aside from those notes that I'm already mentally taking, I'm also asking myself, where are the places or where are the things that I can have fun with, that I can bring myself into the picture with, that I can change, etc. Maybe it could be adding more little figures walking around. Maybe I'm going to be removing this sign, construction sign, or whatever it is that is on the lower left side of the picture that I feel is not really contributing to the composition at all. Maybe I'm going to remove some of the chairs or slightly move the tables, that kind of thing. Once I've created believable 3D structures and believable perspective in the larger structures, I can have fun with the smaller things, with the more irregular or organic shaped things. And as I mentioned in the past video that I shared a few weeks ago, in which I talk about why, even though I'm using reference photos, I don't try to copy what I am seeing. I'm always thinking of how I can bring myself into the composition and even improve it or make it more interesting. I'll make sure to leave a link to that one also down below in the description box in case you'd like to go and check it out. All right, so I really wanted to share this with you because I never get started with anything until after I've acknowledged these major things. It helps the process go a lot more smoothly, and it really helps me arrive at outcomes that I like. All right, so with all that said, let's go ahead and jump straight into the sketching process. So I'm going to be working with an HB drawing pencil. This is the pencil grade that I like using for my preliminary pencil sketches. And the very first thing that I do is you're going to see me use my ruler to create a rectangle in which I'm going to be drawing in. This is important because I want to make sure that the proportions of my drawing area or drawing space that I'm going to be working in are relevant or go hand in hand with the proportions of the image that I'm looking at off my computer screen as I'm going to be drawing this. If I work inside of an area that has very different proportions from my reference image, that is going to make it very difficult for me to arrive at relatively similar proportions to what I am seeing in that reference photo. So this is just an approximation, but as you can see, this rectangle has a lot more width than height, and it is similar to the proportions of that image that I'm going to be looking at. If my proportions are slightly off, meaning if things end up being a little bit wider, a little bit taller, a little bit more to the left or to the right or whatever it is, that in my head is second to developing effective 3D form and perspective, because perspective and 3D form are more important to get correct in order to create a believable sensation of open space and depth than getting proportions exactly the same. Especially when you're drawing a scene or objects. When you're drawing a face, proportions obviously do have to be very, very specific, very precise. I'm making sure to draw lightly so that I can erase mistakes as I go. I always like reminding you guys that drawing is a refinement process. So I'll be doing plenty of erasing and refining and correcting as I go, as I continue laying down shapes and lines, and I notice little errors that have to be corrected. All right, so just like I've explained in past drawing tutorials, I always, doesn't matter what it is that I am drawing, I always like getting started with the largest major structures, major shapes, major forms, whatever you'd like to refer to them as. I always make my way from largest general shapes or structures or forms, and I make my way towards the smaller ones and the details. In the beginning, it's essential for me to tune out all of those smaller things. They're just standing in the way of me getting in those major structures correctly or effectively. And you get better at this. When you're just getting started, it's very easy to get overwhelmed with all of the people, all of the tables, the chairs, all of those little things. But in the beginning, when you're creating the bones for this drawing, those things don't matter. So what I'm focusing on right now are a few of those notes that I took when I was doing my observation before getting started. I'm essentially getting in the front plane and the side plane, the right plane, for this building, taking into account everything that I had noted before, how the lines in this front plane are straight horizontals, and these horizontals create flat rectangles, except for maybe the slightly slanted line. That's the right edge of the awning. And then I am really paying attention to the angles that I see for those slanted lines, the diagonals, on the right side plane of this building. And I'm just getting those angled lines down to the best of my abilities, essentially visualizing the vanishing point where these lines would be meeting off the page to the right. One of the first things that I did that I always like doing whenever I'm drawing a landscape or a scene is I like establishing the horizon line. So always remember that the horizon line is essentially your eye level as the viewer of this scene from your current vantage point. And this is that short horizontal line that you see on the right side. It's very hard to make out the horizon line in this scene because we just see a small section of it and because it's being covered up by so many things. But I find that it is very helpful to visualize where that horizon line would be. It helps me situate everything else and make sure that the perspective is actually believable. As I continue adding in all of these elements, I am continuing to observe that reference photo closely. And as I move along, I am constantly helping myself by laying down straight lines, tick marks, even anything like that that is going to help me situate that line or that shape in its appropriate location, similar to what I am seeing in that photo. I always help myself with lines and marks And another thing that I'm constantly doing, which I talk about in my how to improve your proportions video, I am constantly comparing the different elements that I am laying down and the different elements present in the photo in terms of their width, their height, their location within space. I'm constantly asking myself questions such as, how many times would the width of this element fit into the width of this element over here? How does the height of this element compare to the height of this other element? How does the angle of this line compare to the angle of this other line? Approximately how close is this line to the top edge, the bottom edge, the right edge, or the left edge of my drawing area? If you find it difficult to draw straight lines, also help yourself with the edges of your drawing space that you created for yourself with a ruler, which you know are straight, or with the edges of your sheet of paper, which you also know are straight. As you continue practicing, you'll get better at drawing straighter lines. And something that you can also do, which I often recommend to my students who are having trouble drawing straight lines, is doing basic drawing drills. Take a large sheet of newsprint paper and fill up that large sheet of newsprint paper with different types of lines and shapes, focusing on drawing lightly, on moving your entire arm, and also on holding your pencil effectively for drawing, using the extended tripod grip, the overhand grip, the underhand grip, etc. By this point in the process, I'm already starting to add in smaller shapes. So right here, you can see me add in the windows that are distorted on this right plane. So something that really helps me when I'm adding windows into planes of buildings or houses that are actually receding away from us, like this one here, is I like drawing the line at the top and the line at the bottom that are basically going to tell me where the top edge and the bottom edge of these windows would be. And once I have those diagonals in, telling me where the top and bottom edges of the windows are, then it's just a matter of dividing that space with straight vertical lines, depending on how many windows I'm going to be adding in. So essentially, again, it's like working from general and making my way towards specifics, because first I see that entire section where the windows are as one big shape or block, so to speak. And then once the perspective is right for that block, then I break it up into the smaller shapes. It simplifies the process. Right here, I'm getting started with adding in the little tables and the chairs. And even when drawing the tables and the chairs, notice how I first place all of the little short cylinders for those tabletops. Then once those are added in, I draw in the largest structures of the chairs. So the backrest of the chair and the seat of the chair. I don't worry about the little legs or the table post holding the table, anything like that. I first add in the quote unquote largest shapes. I make sure that the largest shapes make sense with that perspective that is going on. And only after those larger shapes have been placed effectively, then I go ahead and add in the little legs and whatnot. If I start tripping myself up about making sense of those little legs and the little table post and everything like that in the beginning, it's just going to hold me back and it's going to confuse me and it's going to slow down the process. I am focusing on getting in what matters first, which are the tables and the major parts of the chairs. And then once I get that in effectively, it's so much easier to just add in those little lines for the legs. What might be hard about the tables and especially the chairs is that all of the chairs are not perfectly tucked in under the little tables, meaning they are not perfectly aligned to each other or with each other. They have slightly different rotations in space. Even though we know these chairs are exactly the same, they have the same design, they are rotating at different angles within space, which gives them slightly different perspectives. And so just like the building in itself is a large structure and the elements on each plane of this building are getting distorted because of perspective, these little chairs are compound structures in and of themselves. And they have planes in and of themselves that are getting distorted because of their perspective, their rotation in space. And so what I'm getting at is that the shapes created by the backrest and the seat, they are slightly different because they are rotating in space in different ways. We're seeing them at different angles. So all I make sure to do is just try to get in that shape for that backrest and that seat for the different little chairs. I get them into the best of my abilities to communicate that there is a slight shift in rotation throughout these chairs. They're not all the same. And I just try to replicate those shapes to the best of my abilities without worrying too much, because I know that these are smaller structures within this larger scene, this larger composition. And I know that if I got in the largest structures and even the medium structures, if I got them in effectively and the 3D form and the perspective in those larger structures is good, I can tackle the smaller ones a lot more loosely, a lot more quickly without worrying as much, and the perspective and depth is still going to be there if I apply, of course, the major quote-unquote rules when it comes to creating a believable sense of depth and perspective. For example, when I added in the chairs on the right, I did the exact same thing. I first added in the tables and then the backrests and also the little seats. But when it comes to these chairs that are located right along the right plane of this building, well, we have to make sure that the perspective makes sense, because as I'm adding in these chairs, I have to make sure that the chairs that are farthest away from me as a viewer of the scene are smaller than the chairs that are closest to me as a viewer of the scene. So notice how they are getting smaller and smaller and smaller as they are receding away from us. If I had added in all of the chairs and the tables located on that right plane, exactly in the same size, I would get rid of that believable sense of perspective and depth. So this is one of the quote-unquote rules about perspective that I am referring to. You have to make sure that the things that are closer to you are larger and the things that are receding away are getting smaller and smaller the farther away they get, because this is just what happens in real life. All right, so I'm all done with the medium-sized structures and also smaller structures that I had to get in. And at this point, I'm just adding in lines. I'm going to be adding in the handwritten lettering, and I'm also going to be tackling the figures. You just saw me add in those lines for the stripes in the awning, and it's very important that the angles of these lines make sense with this perspective that we're seeing the awning from. Really notice the angles of those lines present in the photo and make sure that they make sense with the edges of the larger awning shape that you created, the diagonals on either edge. The stripes that are right in front of you as the viewer of the scene are more straight vertical, and then as they move away towards the left and towards the right sides of that awning, they become more and more slanted, more diagonal. So what I'm doing here is I'm starting by sketching in my different letters that I'm going to be adding in with my pen and ink. I like sketching in all of the lettering that I'm going to be doing with pencil first, because if I go in with ink right away, I can definitely run out of space or not have my words fit in the area the way that I want them to, or not be centered the way that I want them to. And this is why I always make sure to sketch them in lightly with pencil first. I also like making sure that I understand the design of the lettering that I'm going to be adding in. If it has more of a script kind of design to it, or more of a blocky design, or if it's a serif or a sans serif, I make sure to draw those letter shapes in with my pencil first, because then I can go in a little bit more quickly and loosely with my pen and ink, and I know that any irregularities, any imperfections that happen are going to be pretty minor. Alright, so I'm going to be adding in the little figures, and then I'm going to be adding in a little bit more of the handwritten lettering in the dividing walls on the right plane of the building here. So adding in little figures is super fun. Every artist has his own way of adding in little moving figures into this kind of scene, but this is just what I like doing. So first, I just simplified the entire human figure into basic envelopes or shapes. focusing on the three kind of major parts of the human body: the head, the upper body, and the lower body. Depending on the pose or the action that the figure is doing or taking, the shape of those envelopes is going to be different. I talk about my envelope technique in another sketching tips video, which I'll make sure to link to down below in the text section of this post, in case you'd like to check that out as well. But just like how it's important to simplify something as much as possible and get started with the larger shapes and make your way towards the smaller shapes, I just visualize the entire figure as basic shapes. And once I get those basic shapes in with appropriate or approximate proportions to what I know is believable in real life. I took time to study about basic anatomy and human proportions, by the way, in the past, which I feel is important if you want those figures to look somewhat believable. But once I have created those envelopes and blocky shapes, essentially a blocky shape for the head, a blocky shape for the upper body, and a blocky shape for the lower body, and I made sure that those different blocks or envelopes make sense with basic human proportions, what I do is I either add to them or I break them up into two legs or the torso and the two arms. It depends on the position and the pose on hand. If the arms are outstretched or folded in a specific way that they create a separate shape, I add that shape to the torso shape. If the legs are separated because the person is maybe running or walking and we just see those legs as being separate shapes, then I either create them as two separate shapes or I create one larger shape and then I break it up into two smaller shapes. Notice how as I am sketching in all these figures, I'm bringing in that rule in relation to perspective. The figures that are farther away are smaller than the figures that are closer to us as the viewer of this scene. So in this particular case, we have the figure that is cut off on the far right, that man that has his back to us. That is the largest figure because he is the closest one to us. I really don't fuss about getting in all of the little facial features or the details or anything like that because number one, the style of this piece is intended to be sketchy and simplified. But number two, I don't want to pull the viewer's attention to only the figures. The figures are part of the entire composition. Yes, they are an important part that adds a lot of interest and movement and a dynamic look into the piece, but they are just part of the whole. And if you spend too long adding in the little details in the figures, that is going to create a lot of visual weight in the figures. And then you're probably going to find the need to add in more detail into everything else to balance everything out. And that is not the point here. The point of a scene like this is to see everything as a whole. And the figures are part of that whole composition. I am planning on sharing a video in the upcoming weeks on just practicing sketching all sorts of different figures in motion, the usual positions that would be added into city scenes, urban scenes. I'm planning on sharing a video in the upcoming weeks on how I practice different body poses and figure poses that I could then add into scenes and this kind of drawing and painting. And in that video, we're going to be practicing drawing all sorts of different figure poses together, simplify them, and sketch them in quickly. So stay tuned for that one. I'm excited to share that one with you. I'm always a huge proponent for breaking complex compositions apart into things, elements, layers, techniques that you can practice individually in isolation so that then you're better equipped to tackle those full pieces with more confidence and ease. And I think that by practicing those little figure sketches separately in a sketchbook, that is going to set us up for success when we tackle pieces like these, which require we add in little figures. All right, so I finished up with adding the last little letters and small details in my sketch, and then the last thing that I did before getting started with the pen and ink process was I tapped my kneaded eraser over the entire thing to clean it up and lighten it up a little bit more. And then it was time to get started with my pen and ink process. So I'm just going to be using one pigment liner from Staedtler, and this is 0.3 tip size. I'm going to be using this for the entire thing. So my main objective with this part of the process is essentially to define edges, maybe create some subtle textures with different mark making techniques, and I'm going to add in a little bit of value development using hatching, especially in darkest shadow areas, but that's about it. So you're going to notice how I keep it moving. I like jumping around the entire drawing from section to section. I would recommend though that if you have trouble with smudging, if you are right-handed like I am, what you could do is work from left to right. And if you're a lefty, you can work from right to left. So I'm tracing over my pencil work as carefully as possible, but at the same time, I'm keeping it moving and I'm embracing little imperfections, irregularities, slight wobbles that happen. I'm just embracing that because I know that by keeping it moving and not hesitating too much, my line quality that I develop with my pen and ink is going to be much better. It is better to have lines and marks that have wobbles and irregularities to them, but that look dynamic and that have a line weight variation to them than to have very stiff, perfect looking lines that have just one single thickness or weight to them. A lot of the times as well, when you're moving your arm too slowly and you hesitate, you have those stop and start marks throughout that line that you're trying to create smoothly. So you're always looking for line weight variation. This means that you're looking for certain sections of your lines and marks to be lesser in visual weight, so be lighter and thinner, and other sections of your lines and marks you want to be thicker and darker. You can even see how some of my lines are not even connecting, and this is so that I can really stay away from that flatness, that outliney look that is present in cartoons and coloring book pages. I talk a lot about line weight variation in other pen and ink videos that I've shared in the past, which I'll make sure to link to down below in case you'd like to check them out, because I go much more into depth in terms of what line weight variation is, why it's so important, and the 4 key things that you should pay attention to in the beginning as you're developing your pen and ink skills that are going to help you arrive at that line weight variation in your work. And these 4 things are varying the pen tip size, which in this case I'm just using 1, but if you have enough control over your medium, you can create a line weight variation using just 1 pen tip size or 1 pen. But you can also shift and change the angle at which you're using your pen, the pressure that you're exerting on your pen, and the speed at which you're using your pen. If you practice all of these things consciously and mindfully, you're going to get to a point at which you're drawing with pen and ink, and you're shifting and changing all of these subconsciously, and this line weight variation happens just organically as you're drawing. But especially in the beginning, it's important that you learn about these things, that you're aware about how to develop that line weight variation, and that you consciously practice them, practice shifting and changing them, and also practice, honestly, doing just the basic drills that I was talking about in the pencil part of this process, in which you're just filling up pages, drawing lines and drawing shapes, and that's all you do, because that's going to help you get control over your drawing tool, your drawing medium. Once I have traced over all of these lines that I've created for myself with pencil, I do add in other little details that I didn't add in with pencil for that preliminary pencil sketch. And this is something that I would recommend doing more and more. As you continue practicing, do less with your pencil and do more with your pen. As you improve your pen and ink techniques and get just more comfortable with this medium, you can tell yourself to do less in that pencil drawing process and do more with your pen and ink until you get to the point, if you want to, if it's your goal, to do absolutely everything with pen and ink and skip over the pencil phase entirely. All right, so I'm continuing to jump around this piece pretty swiftly, pretty quickly, and I'm really trying to pay attention to sections of lines or shapes that would be covered up by other elements in front of them, so that I don't accidentally trace over them with pen, because I'm not going to be able to erase that ink after I've traced over those lines. So whenever you have something that is in front of something else that is covering up that thing behind it, you don't want to trace that line, right? because you actually wouldn't be able to see that edge of that thing because it's being covered up by something else. So as you're moving quickly through your sketch, just make sure to have that in mind. I'm leaving the letters until the end here, and I'm also leaving the little figures until the end as well. So right here, I'm carefully tracing over those letters that I had created with pencil. And after this, I'm going to go ahead and add in the smaller letters and also the figures. You're going to notice that after sketching in the contours and the major shapes for the figures, I'm also going to be adding in some hatching in shadow shapes throughout the limbs and under the little elements in the figures and things like that. I'm going to trace around this little drawing. So I'm tracing over the pencil lines that I laid down for myself in the very beginning of this process to define my drawing space or my working area. That's what I'm tracing over right now, just to give a finished look to this piece. If you want to, you can use a ruler, but I actually kind of like the slight imperfections that happen when I just do it freehand. I think it gives the piece a little bit more personality and uniqueness. And finally, just to finish up, I'm going to be going in with some simple hatching. I don't want to go overboard with the detail in this one or with different alternative shading techniques, which I have an entire video on the main alternative shading techniques, which you might want to check out. I'll link to it below. But I'm just going in with simple hatching to create a little bit of a shadow effect, a darker value in shadow areas right under the awnings and also under the chairs and the tables, things like that. Also the shadows created by the figures and in the windows as well. And I'm just gonna leave it at that. At the very end of this process, I allowed everything to dry completely for around 30 minutes. And then I went in with my soft graphite eraser and I erased out all of my pencil work. And that is it. I'm all done with this little city sketch. I hope that you enjoyed this process. I hope that you learned something new, and I hope that I've encouraged you and inspired you to try to do more of these scene sketches for yourself. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I am offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited. They are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops. All have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. All right, you guys, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.